reopen this economy. And when we do, who'll be the one to say, okay, everybody, back to work? Yesterday, President Trump insisted that he had the authority to make that call. But a short time ago, he had a different take.
I will be speaking to all 50 governors very shortly, and I will then be authorizing each individual governor of each individual state to implement a reopening and a very powerful reopening plan of their state at a time and in a manner as most appropriate.
So from the president has total authority to now delegating the power, or at least in his mind delegating the power, to the governors. But this is a fluid situation. It wouldn't be the first time a president changed his mind again. And today, Governor Newsom outlined 6 principles he'd need to see fulfilled before we go back, adding this.
It's incumbent upon all of us to continue to do the incredible work that you've done at peril that we pull the trigger, pull the plug too early. And no, we won't do that to the extent we're guided by these principles and we truly hold the line and make sure the principles advance this call and cause, again, not politics.
So principles and not politics. Newsom has formed a regional pact with West Coast governors about reopening, and New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has assembled his own consortium of East Coast governors to set those reopening standards. So if this is sounding like a good old-fashioned states versus federal government constitutional showdown, Trump has backed off from that, but you never know where it could go. And that's why we are joined now by appellate attorney and scholar Jeff Lewis. Jeff, thanks so much for taking some time to talk to us. I mean, this remains so fluid. And I think that, you know, when the constitutional scholars are thinking about this, I'm going to put you in that company. The 10th Amendment comes up in the Bill of Rights, which essentially says that if powers aren't explicitly delegated to the federal government, they're reserved for the states. So when we talk about this, a state-level quarantine, public health, traditionally, would this be the right of the president or the right of the states?
Well, I think the reason you've heard the president change his position is he's gotten some good advice that this is an area traditionally reserved for the states.
Right. And so now when we think about how this could possibly play out from a precedent standpoint, I mean, you have today, right? Let's imagine this goes to the Supreme Court. Today, he's saying it's for the governors. Earlier, he was saying that hospital supplies are to be administered by the governors, and then he started saying, I have total authority. So if this went to the Supreme Court, it is a conservative court. It is one that might be implicitly sympathetic to a Republican president's arguments. But do you think that these little elements of precedent that we've seen would militate against him in the Supreme Court? How would you imagine the Supreme Court adjudicating this?
Well, in short, the president would lose. I would expect if the conservative majority stuck their conservative principles, they would apply the 10th Amendment and find that this is an area reserved for the states to act.
Right. And sometimes it takes a while for the Supreme Court to hear a case. Obviously, this would be an emergency situation, and they would hear it perhaps a bit more quickly. But if the president wanted to enforce his own prerogative here, there is a legal aspect, which we're discussing, and then there's also this sort of practical and political aspect. I mean, there's billions of dollars in FEMA funds and those sorts of things that he could use. What is the leverage that the president could have in order to get his way with state governors, should he want to override their ideas?
That's a great question. You know, putting legalities aside, I could foresee Trump offering Dodger Stadium or Staples Center financial incentives to reopen early. Money for thermometers, temperature scanners, other money that's needed for health and safety. So there is a practical leverage point the president has with money to influence governors and businesses to open up when the president wants.
So, and then we also think about something that I think, you know, people are really feeling this pain on an employment level. They're feeling this pain on Main Street, right? So there are these businesses who are hearing the president talk about reopening the economy sooner, and they're saying, yes, please, yes. We realize that this is a pandemic, but we need to reopen. So if you had a situation where a governor said, businesses, I hear you, but it's just not safe, and then you had the president say, I'm telling the governors that they should open, what would be the businesses' legal mechanisms here? Who would they sue? Would they sue the governor? How do you think that would look?
I would expect if that conflict arises to see many lawsuits filed, either against the governor or the president or both, to have a judge weigh in on this. But keep in mind, we're not going to be shut in forever. And it's possible the shutdown will be lifted long before a judge actually rules on the legality. Down will be tension between state and federal government.
Right. And historically, you know, we talk about the police power being generally a local concern, a state level concern, which is one of the reasons that we're talking about how the states and the governors really have the prerogative here. But there is a clause in the Constitution that allows the federal government to regulate something. It's called the Interstate Commerce Clause, and it's sort of been interpreted broadly to give the federal government powers where it hasn't before. So how could the federal government use the Interstate Commerce Clause, perhaps, to regulate some of these quarantine orders outside of just hyper-local quarantine orders?
Yeah, the key would be for Congress to actually act and implement a law invoking the Commerce Clause, and thereby empowering itself and perhaps by extension the president to regulate in the areas of interstate commerce, interstate travel, and reopening the economy.
Jeff, we have a final moment here, but as you've seen this constitutional showdown sort of taking place, what thoughts are you left with about the way the presidency is functioning right now with respect to the states?
Well, I was pleased to hear that the president had received good advice and is backing down on this promise to dictate when the economy would reopen, because this is an area under clear precedent that local governments have the ultimate say on.
It's true, and as much as we've seen a lot of precedent, and we've seen the president today speak his mind and suggest that he would be backing off, it wouldn't, as I said earlier, wouldn't be the first time a president has changed his mind if, again, he decides to invoke his prerogative over the states. I want to thank you right now for your time today, Jeff Lewis. Really appreciate it. Constitutional scholar, appellate attorney Jeff Lewis. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.